Here in South Africa, it is winter, and a cold front decided to say hello, which means I now need to stop my pattern drafting or trying to get my perfect block and focus on my winter wear, or at least for the bed. 2 years ago, roughly this time, I made myself some bed socks. The measurements I used was the length of my foot, the width or the circumference of my foot near my toes, the circumference around the arc of my foot, the length of how high I wanted my socks to go, and at that height also the circumference on my leg to ensure that it's not too tight. The pattern drafting was easy. I started with drawing the center line, the length of how high up the leg I wanted my socks to go from the floor. So it's from the bottom of my foot up. Then I drafted the bottom of my foot, and there is a slight calculation I used to get the length I required for the top. That length would be, depending on how I draft the curve by the heel and how far in the curve goes. Now, for the width of my foot, or the width I'm going to make the socks, I'm using half the neck width of the combination or the average between the circumference by my toes and the arc of my foot. I cut out these squares, and only afterwards, since I found it easier to draft the curve, I waited till I was done to draw, cutting them out to draw the curves with for the heel part and the toe part of my socks. How I got this particular measurement is simple. Since I've got a center line, which I'm focused on, it was from the center line to the edge, which would be roughly a quarter of the circumference that I used, minus 1 centimeter. And that is the width I used to draw my curve. If I recall correctly, yes, 2 years later, I can still remember some details. That would have been 5 centimeters, which means it was the top would have been the length of the foot minus 10 centimeters plus from how long I wanted the back part or how high up I wanted my socks to go. Once the corners were done, it was time to make the bed socks. The fleece I'm using for this particular bed socks are actually knitted fleece, and I use part where it's the width of the feet is in the direction which actually is the stretchy direction. Since this pattern is actually a net pattern or a pattern without seam allowance, and my never trusting a size or a pattern when it comes to drafting on 2 or 3 layers, which again came from my underwear mistake, I chose to go with a 1 layer. I traced around the pattern, both patterns, for both socks. I need 2. I got 2 feet, therefore I need 2. then once I've drawn the seam lines, I cut it out I tried with generous, roughly 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. If I look at how I drew my pattern, I had the bottom and back side of the socks, and then as 2 pieces, and the top as a 3rd piece, which means to go to 2 pieces, it was the back side and the bottom I started with. Pinning along the seam line, ensuring I do not shift the sewing lines. Once they were pinned, it was time to sew them. I sewed with a back stitch of 2 millimeters long. Once the back and bottom side of the socks were sewn together, I pinned the top to it, again ensuring that I did pin through the seam lines and not shifting it slightly. With that sewn, it was time to sew it. Again, a back stitch with roughly 2 millimeters of a stitch length. Then it was on to finishing my seams, which I chose to flat fillet, which means trimming down the one seam to 1/4 or half of the width. Because there are 3 seams and one of the seams needed to be cut, it was the seams that went up by the leg that I chose to cut. cutting the seams fully so that it can be just simply flat felt with roughly a 2 mm stitch. Once that is done, you have your bed socks. And if you have seen how this end up being, you will notice some gaps. These gaps are, again, my lack of knowledge when it came to how to pattern draft and sew with stretch fabric. But for those that want an up-to-date version of these bed socks, I'll be machine sewing them in the next coming weeks. Until next time.